All right. Well, I want to welcome folks today to the Emerging Issues Lunch and Learn. We've asked Dr. Steve Coleman with School of Environment and Natural Resources and our soil fertility specialist to talk to us about the effects of pipeline construction on soil productivity and soil structure. So, Steve, I'll turn it over to you at this point.
Great. Well, thanks. Appreciate the opportunity to talk. I certainly don't intend to use the entire hour, but I'm more than happy to take questions as we go through. So if you do have questions or something isn't clear, please let me know. I'll start by saying that I've given a few of these talks at this point, and I started the same way every time, which is just saying that this is a bit outside of kind of what I do or specialize in or have experience in. It's something I kind of fell into in some ways. And I think it started with maybe an email from Rory Lewandowski saying, hey, is OSU doing anything to kind of look at the impacts of what these pipelines are going to do for croplands? I sent a few emails and hooked up with Mark Wilson, who's runs this a consulting company called Land Stewards, and they've been really hired by the main pipeline companies as kind of ag and environmental consultants in terms of providing best management practices and just kind of overall consulting advice in terms of how to do installations as minimally destructive as possible. So I'll acknowledge Mark as playing a really kind of central role in getting a lot of this lined up. Okay. So, oh no, how do I advance slides? Right here, I guess. Okay, great. You can see that. Everybody's got another picture. Okay, great. So, these are common sites that we have.
I do not understand why it didn't work the first time.
Sometimes a lot of disturbance, sometimes little disturbance. Questions arise, especially when, this is a really
4 or 5 foot.
Become very apparent that this is a
really
personal issue. Talk about coming onto someone's farmland, whether that be rented ground or oftentimes private ground.
I don't know either.
Okay. Hi, Debbie. We can hear you. This is something that people pay attention to, of course. There's a lot of disturbance going on, and it is, kind of from a cultural perspective, adds another element of complexity in terms of what is the ultimate impact? What's this doing to my soil? What is this installation going to do to my crops? And then for a lot of growers, of course, what is it going to do for yields, right? So obviously this is a primary concern. There's been payment for an easement rights to come onto a private property and have this pipeline installed. And there's a lot of uncertainty. And I'll just start off by saying I have very, very little answers. I'm not sure if I have an answer to any of the questions I've been asked at this point in terms of what this actually is going to mean for my yield, but this is something we're hoping to address. So this is something that was put out in September 2014. And, I don't know if that was a long time ago or a little, just a few years ago, but there's been a lot of movement in this area, and I highly doubt that this is up to date in terms of the proposed pipelines that are coming across. Dale Arnold with Ohio Farm Bureau and is a tremendous resource if anyone's interested in terms of, he's got a really good understanding of what's kind of in the hopper in terms of pipelines that are new pipelines that are getting installed. There's also a lot of kind of reinstallation or revamping of pipelines. So I really doubt, we can look at this and see some pipelines that are here in existence. It's really hard for me to believe that this is a kind of an exhaustive map in any regard. So a lot of activity, and especially the last year, with a lot of pipelines being actually laid. I don't know what we're at right now, but it's hundreds of miles of, in the last 365 days, right? So asking farmers what are major concerns with pipeline installation. Well, there's a lot of things. We can look at pictures like this and say, it's hard to believe that something like this is not going to cause degradation, right? Like, this is soil that was not treated with TLC, and thinking that you're going to go onto this and farm this and it's going to yield and produce as an adjacent undisturbed areas, I think not realistic framework. Of course, not all sites look like this, but there are worst case scenarios out there, right? So getting back to this question, what are your major concerns? We've got concerns about soil, we've got concerns about the effect of crop, but ultimately yield is, at the end of the day, an economic consideration. And when we think about this and we look at pictures like that, one of the things that comes to mind first and foremost is soil compaction. So we can define this very generically. If we think of soil as a combination of solid, liquid, and gaseous material, when that soil gets compacted, in other words, when a downward force is applied to that, what happens? Well, the water and the solids don't really change proportion, but what happens is the air really diminishes from a lot of pore space or porosity to very little pore space and porosity. So this is universally bad for soil, and it has lots of implications in terms of how plants can grow. Water movement, of course, is greatly slowed. So it's a process that is what we are primarily concerned about. Not the only thing, but we're primarily concerned about this in terms of pipeline installation. You've got a lot of heavy machinery moving across the field, many passes over the same traffic area. And, over time, and maybe it's one single event, but it could be over the course of several weeks, as pressure continues to get applied to the soil profile, we get our macro pores really get constrained, okay? And so that's functionally what we're doing. What does soil compaction do? Well, here's a long list. None of these things we would consider good from an agricultural perspective, right? Causes nutrient deficiencies through root restriction and development, reduces productivity in general. When we reduce aeration and gas exchange, we're decreasing root growth and exploration potential. We're adversely affecting mineralization rates and the turnover of organic matter. We're reducing the ability of that soil to actually store available water, so potential water stress increases for lots of reasons. So a lot of these things are interconnected, right? We compact soil, there's less pore space to actually hold water, but there's often less ability for that soil to infiltrate. In other words, take in moisture with that. So again, a long list. None of these things are good. All of these things we would ultimately consider having negative consequences in terms of crop production, right? So a couple of slides just showing about soil compaction and moisture status. So this is something very intuitive, right? Growers know this. You don't go driving on fields when it's very wet because your chance of compaction greatly increases, right? So there's a function, a kind of a bell curve here. When soils are very dry, our risk of compaction is decreased, and when they're really saturated, your risk of, interestingly enough, your risk of compaction decreases too. But it's really when it's at this kind of field capacity stage is when soils are most susceptible to compaction. Okay, so what that means from an agricultural agronomic management perspective, we're typically driving machinery and taking passes when soils are in this range, right? When they're in kind of an acceptable range. So it's just to understand that there's this relationship. Now, when these crews are going out and laying pipeline, of course, they're not waiting. They're not going out and taking soil moisture measurements and saying, are we in this ideal range? You know, their job is to lay pipe and lay it fast, and they get paid. It's incentivized for that, right? And so this is a primary concern because sometimes we're expecting to find some areas that aren't really affected too much by pipeline installation, and other areas that are greatly affected. And it's really because of the condition of soil moisture having a huge, really determining the degree of compaction that's taken place, the soil moisture status. And then I'll just show this. It's really the same graph, but just showing that management matters. Bulk density here. As bulk density increases, our pore space, our porosity decreases. So in other words, when we have no-till soils and higher organic matter, we can essentially store more water and have resistance to compaction. So I just show this just to underscore that it's not just about soil moisture, but management effects, soil types, processes, you know, all these things kind of play into the degree of compaction. But certainly moisture is a primary variable when we think about that. So, okay, so what are we going to do about it? What are we actually going to look at or research? I don't know if it's surprising or not, but I was a bit surprised that there's really little research that's been done on pipelines specifically. And so if we look to kind of peer-reviewed scientific literature, there's really not a whole lot that actually has dealt with pipelines. There's some handful, maybe a half a dozen studies from all across the world, and environments that aren't particularly really comparable to Ohio with our soils and our climate. And it doesn't mean to say that we don't have any research. There's been, you know, decades of research done on soil compaction and degradation, strip mine reclamation, lots of that sort of work. But when we talk specifically about pipeline installation, and you know, things are different, right? Machinery for strip mine is different than the machinery they use for pipeline installation. So generalities, of course, are there; they exist. But you know, in terms of looking at what research has been done, there's actually been not very much. Okay, and so I'll just be transparent. Our funding is for this project is coming primarily from Kinder Morgan, who is responsible for the Utopia East pipeline. That's running from it's terrible. Henry County maybe, or Carroll County, where it originates from, and then it terminates in Seneca County. So it was originally going to go. It's been mapped a number of different times, but that's the Utopia East pipeline. Of course, here in Wayne County, we have Rover pipeline, which is a much bigger pipeline. We've got Nexus that's coming through. There's a lot of different pipelines that are kind of coming through a number of counties that are kind of clustered. Ohio Farm Bureau is kicking in some money, and then there's a small amount also coming from land stewards via Mark Wilson, and kind of just their commitment to the project and to you know, trying to generate some unbiased information in terms of what all this activity is doing, all this soil disturbance, and if it has you know, real economic implications for producers across the state, and are they being appropriately compensated for those losses, right? So this is, you know, ultimately what we're trying to get at. So what we're really kind of after our design is it's challenging in a number of ways, but we're doing the best that we can. And essentially, if we can imagine an easement area that's been signed, of course, not all of that easement is been disturbed in terms of soil lifting for pipeline. The pipeline area is typically a small percentage of that easement. But we also have an adjacent area of cropland somewhere, presumably, and that has not been affected, and it's not part of that easement. And so generically what we're doing is identifying regions where there is an impacted area of pipeline installation and coupling that with an adjacent undisturbed area. And so that's really our primary design that we're after. So the idea is that this would be a single field or site. We would identify and georeference three areas. We would call this pseudo-replication. It's not a true replicate, but they're essentially three different points in that site, and that site would be one observation. And then we're going to measure plant properties and soil properties from the impacted area and then the adjacent non-impacted area. Okay, so that's kind of conceptually the overview of what we're talking about. The challenge with this is that we're trying to do this over the course of 4 or 5 years. And it's a bit of a commitment to ask from growers, right, to do this and to kind of work with us for that extended period of time. It also strings things out. It makes the project more expensive in terms of just from a budgetary perspective. But we're really trying to get as many numbers as we can, 25 to 50 farms or fields. And that's a number we really don't have any idea of where we're at in terms of if we're going to get that or if we're not going to get that. We want to measure crop yields and some plant properties. Yields are number one variable that we're after. And we're hoping to substitute a lot of kind of intents going off and sampling. I mean, we look at this, right? And sometimes this pipeline area might just be, depending on the pipeline we're talking about, it might just be 6 feet or 10 feet, right? And so if we imagine, say, for however this field is oriented, sometimes it might be perpendicular. The crops might be planted perpendicular to this pipeline. Sometimes they might be planted parallel, or more likely, probably some sort of angled area. We'd really like to rely on yield maps to try to get some estimate of yield, but it's going to be a tall order to do that reliably. And so kind of a second best option is trying to get a fair amount of fields captured through private aerial imagery, which might measure things like, well, take visible imagery, take NDVI as a measurement of crop health. And we're hoping to get thermal imagery as well. So a few different ways that we can kind of capture that over the course of the growing season. So if you're familiar with Air Scout and Brian Sutton's work in terms of capturing these aerial imageries, typically 10 time points a year. And we're hoping that might be a bit of a carrot for growers to be a little bit more compelled to kind of work with us and do this. So that's kind of where we're at. We also want to measure, so I say plant properties, we might be doing some nutrient analysis in tissue or grain. And then we need to take some soil properties just to have some idea, relative comparisons, degree of compaction, degree of infiltration rate reduction, et cetera, et cetera. So really each one of these sites is going to be a little bit unique, right? Different soil types, different management history, different planting dates, potentially different crops, different time and moisture status when that pipeline went through. So it's going to be a noisy data set, and this is not unique. I mean, for a lot of on-farm research that we're doing, this is what we deal with, right? So, okay. Naively, I was like, this is what we're going to do. We're going to basically document can we detect yield declines over time, right? So can we, do we see yield declines in the first year, in the second year, third year, fourth year, fifth year? And then I thought, well, we'll figure that out, and then we'll think about remediation. We'll identify sites that are compacted, degraded, and then we can try to remediate. Well, that was a bit naive on my part, because farmers are already wanting to do stuff. They look at something like this, and they don't want to wait around for 4 or 5 years for some scientific study to come out and figure out that this is. We know that this is problematic, right? And that they want to start actively working to address that. So what we're doing now is, if you're interested, if growers are interested, we can kind of overlay our existing experimental design and do some remediation. And something like this, this makes things more complicated, but we could go and we could do we'll have to do a control of do nothing, right? So what I don't have on these slides is really the research questions. This research question is very simply, does pipeline installation impact soil and crop yields over time? That's what this design is set to answer. We overlay a few of these kind of remediation strategies, and we really start moving into that remediation world of what is, that question might be something along the lines of, what does remediation, or what kind of remediation steps are most effective at fixing this, right? And so we need a control or a do nothing, which is really going to tell us how much of a yield decline or a bulk density increase, or whatever that measurement might be. It's going to tell us what we actually see, and then we can think about implementing 1 or 2 or 3 other practices, like a deep ripping and an organic matter amendment, or what have you. Okay, so from a grower, like from a design perspective, that's really what we're after. It's not a perfect design, but this is, dealing with our constraints. It's as good as that we're going to get, and being realistic about asking for farmer feedback and getting reliable data. So I'll throw this in just in the context of, I had this as my last slide, which is really a very unsatisfying slide, that farmers want to know, how do we fix compacted soil, right? So the first way we do this is to not drive heavy machinery on it when it's wet in the first place, right? We know that compaction events can happen in minutes or seconds, and it can take decades to fix. But we really have 4 options to reverse that process. Steel is probably our most immediate and most effective, deep ripping and tillage. So actually kind of breaking up that compacted layer. We know that organic matter is very important and can contribute to this process. So compost, manure, poultry litter, et cetera, et cetera. We also know that roots can play a really critical part in kind of breaking up compacted soil. So whether those be cover crops, forages, perennial mixtures, deep-rooted perennials are if we are able to take this out of production or annual grain production, that's a nice option to kind of combat that. A final option might be calcium. So this would be things like gypsum and lime. We know that calcium helps the process of aggregation occur. It helps bind organic matter to the mineral fraction of soil. Talk about that more in a second. But there's, I view this as kind of important, but not like a silver bullet approach that's going to work with all soil. So these are really the options that we have, right? And if we think about putting a study together, we can think about these as 4 separate treatments, where we've got a control and then an option of rippage, organic matter, cover crops or roots, and calcium. And then we can think about combinations of all these things. So it gets messy, but we want to really identify a common strategy. And really, deep ripping is my primary, the thing that I would like to see in any remediation study, right? So we can think about this as two separate options. One is that the farmer just puts it out and kind of observes, documenting the impact. The other piece of that, if they want to do some remediation, they can overlay some remediation management strategies, and we can look at that as well. Any questions on this?
Steve, there was a question from Heather about how we as educators could get this information out to farmers who might be interested.
Yeah, it's a great question. So I will say, well, I'll just address that now. I was going to suggest that we hold off, but this project has, not surprisingly, it's a sensitive issue. There's a lot of it's fairly charged politically in terms of what the implications if we do find differences and what that means for landowners and litigation and pipelines in the future, et cetera, et cetera. We have, in many ways, we've done very little up to this point except talk about what we want to do. And a big reason for that is because of just some kind of cross signals that we've received from some of the pipeline, Kinder Morgan primarily in terms of funding the research. And so we were hoping that they would partner with us to provide names and contact information of people that had signed easements. That looks like that's not going to no longer be the case. I think that internally they're concerned about the liability that this project's going to expose them to. So what we really want to do this winter is kind of a more directed, targeted, just getting the word out about this. But it's been frustrating because we've been talking about it for about 18 months, and we really haven't started the work. So some of that is because the pipeline timelines in terms of installation has been pushed back, and there's just a whole slew of other reasons. But our plan is to start this work this coming spring, recognizing that we basically, most of this, if not all of the pipeline, will be installed at that point. So we won't get a baseline pre-installation soil sampling, but we'll start with year one essentially. So, and I've got some resources at the end of the slides in terms of more information and whatnot. So just stay with me. And so options for deep rippage. This is something that we're hoping maybe even start this fall, although the weather's been so miserable. But there's a company coming out of Canada that has kind of a deep rip unit, and they've got I think this is some kind of air assist, or maybe, I don't know if it's Valmar or something to this effect, but where there's actually taking manure poultry pellets. This is broiler or litter. It might even be egg litter that's mixed with sawdust. I know a place that we work with and worked in the past, Herbricks, out of Saranac, Michigan, produces a lot of this, and they sell this as an organic amendment that's relatively high in nitrogen, 4% or so. And so this is a deep ripper with 4 shanks, and then organic matter, this pelleted manure is getting injected at subsurface, maybe anywhere between 8 and 12 inches. So that providing incentive for roots to get down there and tap into those nutrient sources and help break up the compacted layer. I do have a video. It's always unclear if these things work, but I'll just, in case you don't know what that looks like, this just gives you some idea of these units that we could go out and do some of this remediation work with, okay? So again, pelleted. You guys getting that music? Pretty nice, right? Pelleted manure, or we could, think about doing this with lime, or wouldn't have to be poultry manure per se, compost. But this idea of opening up the soil mechanically and then putting organic matter in a place that would encourage root growth. So there you go. Call that number. I actually don't know who these folks are, but maybe I should call them and figure out where they're at. And okay, soil health. Obviously, this is a topic that's talked about a lot of interest in this. We're doing a lot of work just in general. You might be aware, just trying to figure out, not just testing soils for nutrient availability and chemistry, but also looking at things like biological indicators and soil physical structure. This project, we're very interested in measuring physical structure because we think that's going to be what's most degraded. And I'll just show this, give you a teeny soil science lesson about soil aggregation. These are the chunks, right, that make up soil. It's the organic fraction and that mineral fraction coming together. And so soils form and aggregates form, and soil structure and tilth and porosity are a product of it's really a biologically driven phenomenon at roots and microorganisms, fungi and bacteria, producing a lot of kind of glues and polysaccharides that help chunks of soil stick together, all right? So the idea is that these things form primary particles that they start to self-aggregate into what we might call a microaggregate or a sub-microaggregate that forms into these larger microaggregates and then macroaggregates. The bigger these pieces form, the bigger our pore space becomes, right? When we get lots of macroaggregates forming, we have large pore space and high porosity of that soil. So air and water can strongly can interact and exchange to a large extent. When we do primary tillage, it's these macroaggregates rather that get destroyed first, and then these are the smaller the bits, they're more resilient to degradation, but the macroaggregates are what are chopped up first. And this is just a key feature of what happens in soil, what determines if a soil is well structured, which will determine, of course, drainage and soil moisture dynamics in lots of ways. So how are we going to measure things? Things that we're going to measure, I talked about bulk density. We like soils like this with lots of pore space, lots of porosity. When they're compacted, they function much less. And so we do this. Bulk density is really just a measurement of mass, how much that soil weighs for any given unit of volume. And so we've got these rings. We'll pound them into the soil, or we'll sample them with a sampler. There's a known volume of this core. We dry these down, we weigh them, and then we know basically what our bulk density is of that soil, right? So that's one primary measurement we'll do. Aggregate stability via rainfall simulation. This is something that the Cornell Soil Health Lab does, and we're adopting this approach. It's a slaking test. If you've seen this, essentially, this is a rainfall simulator that just drips on the soil. The ability of that soil to resist slaking or breaking up when it's wet is a direct indicator of the degree of aggregation. And so if we get a lot of soil that falls through the sieve, then we have not very well aggregated soil. So this is one measurement that we do in the lab. In the field, we do, for compaction and identifying compaction layers, we use a penetrometer, which is just a measurement of the resistance of pushing a probe into that ground. So this is it's It's a variable measurement. You get a lot of variability. It's highly dependent on soil moisture. But this is something that we would go out and take, and you can get estimates through depth of surface compaction and subsurface compaction, right? So this is just showing a lot of subsurface compaction in zone tillage relative, oh wait, let me say it again, conventional tillage relative to zone tillage, okay. Finally, infiltration, a very important measurement. This is the ability of the soil to receive moisture. How much water can that soil take in a set amount of time? It's a rate function. It's typically measured as a length of water per unit time. So like millimeters per minute or centimeters per hour or something like that is how that would be reported. So I think that's, these are the type of measurements that we'd be doing in addition to yield and in addition to aerial imagery. And so all the soil measurements, we would anticipate coming out to farmer site and doing that ourselves. We would ask for farmers to help with some of the yield data collection, and if they have yield monitors, to share those files with us. Get asked the question about crops. We're primarily looking for corn, soybeans, and small grains, essentially annual grain crops. We also can look at things like perennial forages. If it's, we really need a measurement of productivity, a measurement of yield. And so if those are graze systems, that's going to be really challenging to accurately assess that. If we think about this framework, how are we going to measure if it's just a stock graze? How are we going to be able to measure reliably the yield of the impacted area versus the adjacent unless we're fencing this off or something? So grasslands are challenging, or hay fields are challenging, but we could still work with them. It will be more work because there's multiple harvests and it's typically a little bit more complicated. So, okay, so as promised, if you go to this URL, go.osu.edu/pipeline, that will basically take you to our lab website, and you can sign up there. There's links to sign up if you have farmers that are interested. We have a one-page, a page and a half handout that I actually don't know if that's posted on the site, but we can share that or post that with anyone that's interested. We're really hoping to kind of get our ducks in a row, and this is going to happen before winter programming. We haven't decided how extensive our reach is going to be, if it's going to go through like 7-8 counties. It's really just going to focus on stuff that's more local to us, so we can actually get to places and do it reasonably. There's some details that still need to be worked out, unfortunately, but again, we've got a bit of a moving target in terms of who we're partnering with and their degree of enthusiasm for this work. So I think that's all I have. I think I've covered everything. I'm not sure if you all have questions. I'm more than happy to take them at this time.
Steve, do you have at that site, or could you put together maybe a protocol, or how educators could be involved that are interested in doing some of this and maybe would help alleviate some of the time that you and your folks have to be out in the field?
Yeah, that's something that we are working with right now in terms of putting protocols, and it's something that we could provide you with any of the materials for that as well. It is a great point, something that we don't think about enough in terms of just trying to recruit folks to help. What I anticipate, and I should have said this more explicitly, but just sometime before the end of this year, that we will communicate with educators that, like, this is what we're doing. These are the finalized decisions, and here's our time frame for the work. And, if you do have farmers, please put those in contact with us, or let us know if you want to be the point person. It's obviously, I'll just tell you, we're not rich in cash from this project. There's not a whole lot of money. And, the help that we can get would certainly be appreciated and would help extend. The aerial imagery in itself is not particularly cheap, but we feel like that's a important and potentially very helpful way to get really robust yield data or plant response data. Because I'm personally concerned about really being able to get reliable yield information from kind of small areas like that. Depending on the orientation of the field and whatnot, if trying to get grain carts in there, or it just might be, it could potentially be really challenging. So we anticipate probably doing some hand harvesting of corn and potentially soybeans in small areas, and we have had success. It's not as nearly as it's not as painful as it might sound initially, but it's not ideal, and it all takes time. And so some help with that, would be greatly appreciated. So I'll leave it at that for now. And this, hopefully in a couple months we can provide more guidance in terms of what we're after. Hopefully it's before then even, but boy, the way things have been moving with this project, it's just, it is like molasses. So, and the other bit of it is that we're waiting for a second installment of funding to hit before we really go out and inadvertently ruffle any feathers. So that's another bit of the reality of this. So it is a kind of a sensitive subject. So
Thank you. Other questions for Steve?
I'm not sure if I have a question or comment, Steve. This is Peggy Hall. I do the ag law work, and so I'm thinking about damages and compensation for the compaction. So I think something interesting to think about as you work through your study is, is there some way we could kind of package a per acre cost that we could have our landowners prepared to, assert if they claim there are damages, just based on what you think the remediation measures could be. I don't know if that's possible, but.
Well, so just to clarify, are you talking about per acre of like crop loss, or per acre of like remediation expense, or what are we measuring?
I think it would have to be per acre of disturbed, the disturbed area. So what would be the cost to remediate that disturbed area? Could there be some way that, I know there's going to be a lot of variation, but that could be a real challenge for a landowner and in current easements if they're claiming those damages, but also just in future easements, what's a good way to protect the landowner from the costs, or how to frame that in an
I mean, those are great points. And, just personally, my interest in this is really about trying to protect landowners, because I know it's not, I've talked to lots of people about this. Some of them are very upset with how things have gone down. Some of them are tickled pink. They're not, they're like, oh yeah, they've been really good to work with, et cetera, et cetera. And some are like, not, that's not a universal experience, of course. And so, we are hoping, things about like costs of remediation, coupling that with how effective the remediation was in terms of plant response. Like, did deep ripping and injecting organic matter actually increase crop yield, right? Did it help offset the cost of that remediation process? So those are things that we are really hopeful that we can get at least ranges, right? Like some relative range of like what that might cost on an acreage basis.
Good.
But you know, I have a number of concerns. We'll have people enroll and do it for a year or two, and then, you know, another fall when it's a wet fall like this and there's still a lot of crop in the field, they're going to tell us, I ain't got time for that. You know, I just got to get this stuff out of the field. And so I'm fully anticipating that our farmers, as we progress, we'll have some people that just don't, you know, they'll fall out, right? So, and it's almost at that point that it becomes really important, right? Because we can envision a scenario where 1 or 2 years we get damaged, but this really anecdotal industry standard is them to tell everybody 3 years and you're back in business, right? Back to normal. And like, I can't imagine that's really based on any, I mean, it's not based on real data. It might be meaningful, but from an anecdotal perspective, right? But it's not been from them going out and actually measuring yields over their pipeline versus an adjacent area. So it's a great comment. You know, objectively, we're just trying to go into this with open eye, or like just an open mind, and say, you know, there's some sites that we might not be able to detect any loss, and that, you know, that's what we actually hope to see, right? We don't want the entire state to be degraded by this event, by this installation. So, but I think we'd be naive to think that we're not going to find major crop losses, at least on some fields. And how long does that last? And what is that on a dollar basis? Like, what's that actually costing the farmer, right? So we don't know what they negotiated for their, you know, for that easement, right? And we're not going to have that information, but that's fine. I mean, we don't need it. We can just state somewhere within this range is a reasonable expectation of lost profitability. So.
And I think if you work from that perspective, ideally you would just include that in the demand you'd make for what you want to be paid for the easement. Mm-hmm. You know, so moving forward, we could really use those numbers. But I know in a lot of the easements, there's some general language, and that may not have entered into the negotiated amount of the easement then.
Yeah, and that's the thing. Like, you know, from talking with farmers that have signed easements, it's a lump sum. This is what you get. It's a number that was some percentage reduction multiplied by 3 years, and that's like, you know, that's what you get. So a great goal out of this would be you know, I think we'll get it, but it's just a matter of how robust that information is in terms of what is a reliable estimate, right? Could be like a very big range. It could be $5 an acre to $200 an acre. I mean, that's not particularly helpful, but hopefully we get something a little bit more constrained than that.
Other questions or comments for Steve? Did the questions in the chat box, were those answered? I think they were, but if not, speak up.
I can't see the chat box, so if there are other questions, somebody.
There's 2 pipelines going across Stark County, and there probably will be some interest in that county. And says, if I understood your explanation, the information is likely available, will likely not be available, if available, until spring of 2018. I think you addressed that by saying you hope to have something out by the end of the year.
That's right. Yeah, that's my goal. We need to give you guys information so you can plan with your winter programming. We'll have, and you know what I intend to do is essentially send you all, send interested educators or soil and water folks or whoever, just kind of handouts, maybe some nice color handouts or postcards that just give a very brief overview of what we're trying to accomplish and what would be required. So, yeah.
Okay, any other questions or comments?
I guess a quick question, Steve. On the other side of it, do you know if anyone's doing any research as far as looking at the practices the pipelines use now to determine if there's some changes they can make in their installations that might kind of help some of this compaction problem?
Yeah, so that's a good question. You know, I believe that at least organizationally, the people that with Kinder Morgan, you know, there's some pipeline folks that had no interest in this at all, right? And Kinder Morgan did, to their credit, step up to the plate and put money down to see this. And I think that was generally, you know, you could be cynical and say it's a PR stunt, but I believe from our conversations, they generally want to know, to minimize the damage, right? They want to have good relationships with their clients. They don't want to like just come through and rape and pillage and then get that reputation. They are, you know, every pipeline has a protocol associated with what they're going to do, and all of them, the big three of Nexus, Rover, and Utopia are all doing double digs, which is taking the topsoil off, putting it in one pile, taking the subsoil off, putting another, and then hopefully putting them in the opposite order, not reverse order. And some places are even a triple lift, what they call a triple lift, which is doing that in 3 highly sensitive areas would get 3 separate piles, right? And so they want to know if that adds a fair amount of cost, you know, to the operation, and they want to know if that's worth it and what they get out of it, et cetera, et cetera. So I do believe that, you know, one of the outputs that we could hopefully come up with is just kind of a best management practice for the installations. These are the things that we really need to kind of consider. It's tricky because, you know, I'm less confident that we're going to have really good information about that than what we were talking about earlier, because we don't have any, like, that's not built into the experimental design at all, like double dig, like a 2-pile system versus a single consolidated pile. So that's all going to be kind of just anecdotal information, or trying to pair up sites that were dealt with. Maybe I think some of the things are going to be obvious, like looking at soil moisture and when sites were installed, and that being a main driver of degradation. So.
Steve, there was a question in the chat box if you are available to make this presentation or a similar presentation to farmer groups.
Sure. Yep. Yeah, I'm happy to do that. I am. So this is, you know, I feel it's an important project. I've been telling people I'm trying to limit a little bit of my on the road time this winter because of focusing on the tri-state racks. But you know, this is something that, I mean, we're committed to the process, and we need sufficient enrollment for success. So if that means coming out, I'm happy to do that. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Any other questions or comments? If not, Dr. Coleman, we appreciate your time. A lot of good information there.
Okay, great. Thanks, everybody. Appreciate yours.
We'll just encourage you to look out for other announcements of other lunch and learn programs that the Emerging Issues team is putting together, and those will be sent out in email. And again, I appreciate everyone being here.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Steve.
Thank you.